It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Obesity is costing the UK billions of pounds. So is the answer to stop us getting fat or treat us with drugs? Last year, Labour made this promise.
Labour will start by bringing forward an employment rights bill to legislate for this within the first 100 days of...
But has the pledge on workers' rights been watered down? Also today...
We are looking at potentially very large sums indeed.
So, can we afford to compensate the so-called Waspi women over lost pension payments? Joining us today, Conservative MP Kit Malthouse, Labour's Rebecca Long-Bailey, Bloomberg UK's Associate Editor Alva Ray, and former Conservative advisor Samuel Kasumu. This is Politics Live. Let's start with this headline. BBC News story, Rishi Sunak attacks Keir Starmer over defence as election battle lines drawn. We discussed the issue of the defence speech by the Prime Minister, yes, trying to create a dividing line between the government and the Labour Party. But more generally, has the election campaign begun?
Oh, yes, of course. I mean, to be honest with you, we're slightly back to where we were with the Fixed Term Parliament Act. We all know it's got to happen by January the 25th. I think it's the 25th is the maximum it can go.
But that's
doesn't seem to me like we're going to be campaigning over Christmas. So it's going to be, as the Prime Minister has said, at some point in the second half of the year. My bet is the second Thursday in October.
Right, OK. Well, that's your bet. But have we already started, literally, the campaign?
I mean, the campaign actually started probably about 6 months ago in earnest. That's when the plan emerged. And delivery of the plan over the summer is what presumably will lead to a platform at the general election. So, yeah, it's going to be a long one.
Has the election campaign begun?
Well, it looks like it's heading to be the longest election campaign in British history, unless the Prime Minister calls a general election, and that's what he should do as soon as possible. We saw him do another relaunch yesterday, the 7th relaunch in 18 months, in a desperate attempt to hide 14 years of abysmal Tory record. We've got reports from the Trussell Trust this morning that they're seeing a record year for food parcel distribution. People are worried about their mortgages. We're seeing huge levels of job insecurity. We need a change of government, and we need one now. You were raising your eyes there. Why, Kit?
Oh, no, just because it's the standard Labour line, right? So,
it's the truth. It's not
necessarily the truth. As the Prime Minister laid out in his speech yesterday, there are lots of things we could look back on over the last 10 years and be proud of, not least, for example, you didn't mention the advance in standards in our schools, which has been enormous. The fact that you are safer now from a crime point of view than you've ever been before, that we have more police officers in the country than we've ever had before. There's lots of positive things. Now, I'm not saying everything has gone brilliantly well. There's lots of work to do, as there always is in a country like ours. But I don't know, Rebecca, you're not part of Project Starmer, so I kind of expected more than the Labour line.
The government announced recently that it was going to release dangerous prisoners into the community because of the crisis that we've seen in the prison system over the last 14 years. This has been a crisis that the government has known about during its whole term of government. It should have been investing in law and order. It should have been investing in our prison system. It shouldn't be releasing dangerous offenders into the community.
Crime is at an all-time low. Right, absolutely. Burglary, robbery, violence, all of it is well down. And they're not talking about releasing dangerous prisoners. They're talking about releasing prisoners on tag who, after assessment, might be able to get out. And we've got the biggest prison building programme in history. So, you know, you can spin it either way, but come on, you and I
mean, Alva and Samuel, this is a perfect illustration of what we're in for, which may be exciting to some people, less so to others. But Kit Malthouse and Rebecca Long-Bailey have set out some of the contours, haven't they, of what we can expect?
Yeah, I mean, certainly as a journalist based in Westminster, I would say it feels like the election campaign has already begun. I mean, there's very little happening in the way of legislation. I mean, it's sort of a snapshot of my life. It has been very much going to Rishi Sunak's speech yesterday, going to Keir Starmer's speech in Dover on Friday. It hasn't been about what's happening in the House of Commons, and I think people in both parties would acknowledge privately that there's not much happening from this government anymore on a legislative front. It's more campaign mode, and I suppose that kind of raises the question about how good that is for the country. Even if we find the politics of it fun, if you have a government that isn't as focused on delivery anymore, is that in the best interests of the country when there are so many problems? And I think everyone would acknowledge that.
And what's at stake then for the main parties, given that timescale?
Well, I think on the Labour side, I mean, I'm very interested in everything that they've got in their manifesto. You know, they had this deadline for submissions for it back in February because they were anticipating a possible May election. They made those submissions and they're essentially having to sit on those proposals. They say they're working on them and that was just the beginning phase. But basically, they have all these ideas ready to go that they're hoping don't leak in the next few months and that things don't unravel. Meanwhile, the Tories are basically just waiting for the economy to pick up. I mean, we saw some indications that it is, but they're hoping that that will trickle down to people on the ground.
Samuel, do you agree with that? Has the election campaign already started?
Oh, certainly, 100%. We're in the middle of what some would call a long campaign, and I thought it was quite strange yesterday that the Prime Minister had a very good speech, but he also had a cabinet member giving a speech around the same time. So I think over the next weeks and months, you'll find that there's a really credible grid, announcements, and Rishi Sunak will hopefully lay out a narrative that is compelling. I actually agree with Rebecca to an extent. I think that there is a desire for change. You know, the winds of change are blowing through the whole of the country, and so the Prime Minister's challenge is how is he going to be able to position himself as somebody that understands the mood of the country and ultimately is the right person to move us forward.
I mean, do you think Alva is right that the Conservatives and the government are literally just waiting for the economic metrics to improve?
I'm not sure, but what I would say is clearly, you know, we're almost into summer, and once we get into summer, not much happens in the House of Commons anyway. And then once we come back from summer, we have party conference season. So as much as there is a bit of a wait, actually not much would have been done anyway within the time span between where we are now and when the next election is going to be.
I mean, are you expecting the manifesto, the outlines of it, pretty shortly? Because there is going to be months now of Labour trying to sustain its extensive poll lead. Kit will no doubt say they'll narrow those polls between now and then. How are you going to do it?
I hope we do see some elements of the manifesto published soon, but the problem, and this is a problem for all political parties, is that when you set out your stall, it leaves you at risk to have some of your policies stolen by the other side. So non-DOMs, for example, that's a case in point where the Conservatives saw it as a good policy and decided to take it for themselves. So I think there'll be a bit of caution from the Labour front bench about setting out too much. And that's why we need a general election now. I think the country should have the opportunity to see what each party stands for, what policies they're intending to deliver in the next government, and then get the chance to vote on that. At the moment, we're just in a permanent political limbo, and it's not good for the country at large. Are you just waiting for something to come around?
No, I mean, obviously, our government's elected for a term. The term isn't up yet. Prime Ministers generally go between 4 and 5 years, and it should come as no surprise that they generally try and choose a moment that's most propitious for them to continue their project. So it shouldn't come as any surprise. And I do think, you know, the Prime Minister's laid out over the last few weeks a series of policies on defence, on welfare reform and other areas, I mean, yesterday on security, which are forming the bedrock of a manifesto alongside the so-called plan that he's got out there as well. So I think the thing the Conservative Party is trying to do is lay out the differences. What I hope won't get, and I hope Rebecca's right that they'll roll out some of the policies. You can't spring it on the British people at the last minute and then expect them to vote for you. You've got to give them time to metabolise the things that you're proposing, most of which I strongly predict will be disastrous, but nevertheless, it will be good for us all to get a look at it.
Right, well, hopefully that will happen soon. In the meantime, let's discuss some other pressing issues. In the Times, weight loss jab reduces heart deaths by a fifth. It's a new study, an injection designed to tackle obesity, which could also reduce the risk of heart attacks and strokes in people, regardless of the amount of weight they lose while on the drug. Now, obesity is a huge problem in the UK. It has an enormous impact on people's lives, on the NHS and the economy. Let's talk to Dr. Charlotte Refsum, Director of Health Policy at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, to get a sense of how big that impact actually is. Welcome to you, Charlotte Refsum. Tell us, in terms of the research you've done into obesity, about its impact on the economy.
Thanks, Jo. Yes, this is something that TBI have been interested in for some time, and we commissioned a piece of work last year looking at the economic impact of obesity and overweight on the UK. And what we found was that it impacted individuals, the NHS and the economies separately. The number overall was about 98 billion a year, which, just to give a bit of perspective, is about 2.5 times the education budget, or about 4% of GDP. But what's interesting is if you break that down, 2/3, the majority, actually falls on individuals and their families. So individuals through healthy lives, years lost of their life, and friends of family through the informal care that they often give. About 1/3 of the economic cost falls on the state. So that is equally split between the NHS and the economy. So the NHS usually spends about 19 billion a year treating obesity and obesity-related diseases. And then there's a hit to the economy of reduced productivity to the account of sort of 16 billion.
I mean, those are substantial figures. How interventionist, in your mind, should the state be in terms of tackling this problem?
I think there's obviously a mixed approach to this. There's no silver bullet. We tend to think there are three big things the government can do. The first is around regulating the commercial food environment. I think the focus of policies so far has been a lot on the individual responsibility. And of course, that is an important factor. But it hasn't worked very well, frankly. And with 57% of the food on our shelves being UPF or ultra-processed food, I think it's just too hard to be healthy a lot of the time. So regulation around marketing of food to children, to adults, reformulation, planning laws, that sort of thing. So there's a big piece of work there. But also, I think there's a lot of work to do in incorporating some of these new treatments. And there's an indication that beyond obesity, as we've seen today, that they may end up reducing stroke and heart attack at incidence of cardiovascular disease. I think the issue is going to be how we get those treatments to people, actually, because there are about 4 million people in the UK today who are eligible for some of these treatments, and only about 40,000 weight management services that provide them.
Just stay with us while I bring in the rest of the panel. On a drug being used, Kit, first of all, do you think that's the way to go? Just make some of these weight loss drugs more available to people who classify as obese, rather than going for an interventionist state approach?
Well, I think you have to do a bit of both. As your viewers will no doubt have noticed, I'm bigger than I should be. Having lost a few pounds recently, it's largely down to a guy on Instagram called Eddie Abu, who's worth looking up if you're struggling with your weight or other health conditions. But look, I'm also was the original founder of the All-Party Group on Life Sciences, and I do think that pharmacology and life sciences are going to solve so many of our health problems into the future, and it will raise enormous challenges. So in the same way, for example, that statins are now the most prescribed drug across the Western world and are doing huge amounts for heart disease, these drugs hold out the same. And incidentally, I also do a fair amount of or take an interest in addiction generally, along with Dan Carden, who's a Labour MP, in drugs, alcohol, food, other addictions. You know, there's a lot of stuff coming down the track that will help with some of these very damaging addictions. So, for example, there's a drug out there now called buprenorphine, which is effectively an inoculation against opioid addiction, right? So there's enormous promise there. But the key thing is, I do think we could do more early on to stop people getting there in the first place. And that includes also things like labelling. Our food labelling is rubbish at the moment. The little tiny box, you can't see what it says, right? We need something big and obvious so people can start to make proper judgments for themselves.
Samuel, you were at number 10 at the time when Boris Johnson was looking at all sorts of restrictions on things like junk food advertising, on the sorts of labelling issues. They haven't delivered, though, have they?
Yeah, advertising to young people.
Yeah.
We had a very comprehensive obesity strategy. The Prime Minister was obviously someone who almost died during the pandemic, partly because of his weight. And so it was really sad to see that actually that work was pretty much shelved when myself and some of my colleagues moved on.
Right, why was it shelved?
That's a question for Rishi Sunak, or maybe Liz, if that happened before his time. I think the big challenge is we have a lot of libertarians in the centre-right who are very uncomfortable with the idea of telling people what to do and how to live their lives. But as we heard just now, when somebody is overweight, it has an impact not just on themselves, but on the economy, our National Health Service, etc. So there's a balance to be struck here.
I mean, look, I admit to being a bit of a sceptic on this stuff, right? And even when I see things like, apparently the sugar tax has taken something like 46,000 tonnes of sugar out of our diets.
But that's just on soft drinks,
on soft drinks, right? So, but I'm a sceptic, and the reason I'm a sceptic is because I do believe that the more government takes responsibility for people's health, the less they take responsibility themselves. And I think what a strategy industry should do is look at ways of helping them to take responsibility. So, for example, on labelling, I would love to have a label that shows me by proportion how much sugar, fat, all the rest of it, rather than a little box.
I suppose
I'd love there to be more education on that stuff in schools. I think is really important, particularly for parents. You know, and if you look, as I say, on social media, there's quite a lot of stuff there now about diet and ultra-processed foods.
But is that going to be enough?
But I suppose things like, you know, buy one get one free for food that's not good for you is not helpful when you are at the checkout in the supermarket. A child seeing certain advertisements when they're watching cartoons.
Cheap food for people.
Well, hang on.
Sometimes
where is the balance? How interventionist should the state be? Do you agree with Kit? You don't want to be telling people how to live their lives, how to be healthy. But is obesity now such an important issue in terms of the economy?
It is, because it's got a huge impact on our economy overall and the quality of life of those people who are experiencing obesity. And I think there was an interesting report done by the Institute for Public Policy Research who called on the government to stop treating obesity as an individual issue and to look at some of the causes of obesity. So one cause, for example, is that there's a clear link with poverty. Areas of deprivation tend to have higher levels of obesity. That can then in turn be linked to the cost of food. It's higher prices for healthy food like vegetables than it is for ultra-processed foods, and that means you can ask your supermarkets to start taking some responsibility for this and to make sure that healthy foods are far cheaper. And then the second point is about making sure that public health is properly funded, that you've got leisure facilities in your local area. Salford has leisure deserts because we don't have enough funding for our local authority to provide them for people. So you can't expect people to be healthy but not have the facilities in order to do that.
But that will cost money, of course, won't it? And are Labour committed to do those things?
Well, it'll be good for the economy overall. And there was another interesting report that's done by Frontier Economics a few years ago that if the government invested in tackling obesity and even just reduced it by 10%, the overall economic benefit resulted in about £6 billion to the economy per year. So it makes economic sense to invest in people's health.
But there are just simple things. I mean, I sort of agree, Rebecca, particularly about food. I mean, I've never seen buy one, get one free on bags of carrots or lettuce, right?
Exactly.
So it'd be quite good to see some of that. But also, I think the public don't understand that quite small adjustments to your life without leisure facilities, like going for a brisk walk twice a day. Yeah. I mean, we got a dog, right? I've been doing a lot of walk. It's great for you and very good for your health. There's lots of things that you can do that are small adjustments rather than telling the public it's all a disaster.
No,
your whole life's got to change.
that would need a public health campaign. I mean, are either of the parties really committed to telling people to be healthier in the way we've just heard, investing in the sorts of facilities and perhaps health facilities like leisure centres, and more importantly, making supermarkets, making food more expensive, unhealthy food more expensive?
I don't think that they are. I think it kind of did take, as Sammy was saying, it did take Boris Johnson's personal experience to see a big sort of policy shift on this from the top, and then that was quite quickly abandoned. Even though Rishi Sunak himself is quite into clean living and would probably actually, if he had more time in government, be maybe interested in some of these policies. But there's a very interesting book out at the moment called Ultra Processed People, which looks at this, and the author of that book makes a really compelling argument about how bad ultra processed food is for people. And I think the interesting thing is that he's very careful not to blame individuals. The point of the book is not you, individual person, Jo Coburn or whoever, need to cut down on this. He basically argues it's impossible for the individual because of the entire way the food industry works. It's impossible to know what you should be buying, and it's that all the signals are completely unclear, and it needs to kind of happen at the level of the food industry and regulation.
Well, let's bring Dr. Charlotte Refson back in, because you've been nodding away to some of what you've heard. Do you agree there with that last point? There needs to be a much tougher approach towards the food industry and the sort of food we're buying in the supermarkets?
Yeah, I do. I think that the commercial food environment is really important. I think it's as I said before, 57% of the food on the shelves is ultra processed food, and it's just too difficult to be healthy a lot of the time when you're working. So we would advocate for more regulation around marketing of junk food to kids, to adults, pushing for more reformulations, maybe looking at the planning laws and building of fast food restaurants or outlets rights around schools, and even looking at fruit and veg subsidies and things like that. I do think there's much more that the government could be doing.
Right. Do you think politicians are too reluctant to tackle this head on because they don't want to say to people you might have to pay more for healthy food or for food to go up at a time when people are struggling, and also just getting too involved in people's lives?
Yeah, I understand that. But I think it's interesting that, obesity has now overtaken smoking as a leading cause of death in this country. And we are now looking at legislation to stop children ever being exposed to smoking, but not taking the same approach to obesity, which I think is really sad.
And aren't they the same thing then, Kit? You're puffing and puffing
Well,
there,
no,
to coin a phrase. But I mean, Rishi Sunak has taken a pretty interventionist approach on smoking.
I'm chewing over the arguments. As I say, I do think that we have to be very careful to leave the primary responsibility for your health with the individual. So I'm responsible for my health, right? Nobody else. And I have to deal with it myself, and so does everybody else. But what I need is information. And I think the best thing for me, I think the best combination is, and we shouldn't poo-poo the fact that we have cheap food in this country, right? It's very good for the population generally. We live a lot longer than we did when I was born, right? Things are generally going in the right direction. And as I say, life sciences is going to solve, they're just about to cure cancer, for God's sake. So there's all sorts of stuff going on that's great. But give me plentiful information, educate me correctly as a child, and I'll make the right choices for myself as I grow up. Right. And I think making food expensive for people and hoping that they'll still only buy one pizza rather than two is crazy.
The challenge is supermarkets, folks who make food, restaurants, they understand behavioural science. And so you could give individuals more information, but every time you walk into a restaurant or a supermarket, somebody is trying to sell you something in ways that you might not understand. You know, where they put things, how they position certain things, even in a menu, has a material impact on things you consume.
And so, particularly for children.
Yeah, so it's not, well, for adults too. I don't think it's a fair fight. I think there are individuals who want to do better, but folks who know how to get you to do things that are probably not very good for you are the ones who are doing it in order for them to be more profitable.
I mean, do you think you could take a leaf out of Rishi Sunak's book when it comes to smoking? He wants to sort of ban smoking for a future generation, younger generation. Should we be treating the causes of obesity in the same way?
I think Labour's already set out the beginnings of a plan in relation to children's health. So, for example, we're calling on the banning of junk food adverts after 9 o'clock. We're trying to increase the amount of physical education that pupils do in school and make it mandatory so that that love of exercise is hardwired, because once you start putting weight on, it's very, very difficult to get it off. So if you start kind of trying to educate people in childhood of the importance of healthy eating and the importance of exercise, it's something that they will hopefully carry on into their adult life. But I think there is a mixture between individual responsibility and state intervention. But as I said before, you've got to make it easier for people to be healthy. And that means making sure the supermarkets take responsibility in bringing the cost of healthy food down. And it means increasing the budgets for local authorities that have been decimated in the last 14 years so that they can have public health initiatives and invest in leisure facilities.
There's plenty of public health information out there. It's just a question of getting it
to
people.
But is it a fair fight?
Well, you've got to balance. As Rebecca said, there is a balance. We're not sheep in a field. Well, right? The government is not the farmer there to decide what we eat, where we go, have a sheepdog to herd us in the right direction and cut our hair once a year, right? we have to have a certain amount of agency for ourselves. And as I say, if you get into a society where everything is done for us, everything is somebody else's fault, then we're doomed.
Well, on that happy note, Dr. Charlotte Refson, thank you very much for joining us. Let me show you this headline in The Guardian. Union chiefs to hold showdown talks with Starmer over workers' rights. Yes, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, is meeting with 11 union bosses today at Labour headquarters. It comes following concerns from union bosses that Labour's sweeping reform of workers' rights could be watered down. Are you worried about this, Rebecca?
Well, Keir Starmer said, I think it was yesterday, that there would be no watering down, and I hope that that is true, because the Tories have broken Britain. They promised us a high-wage economy, but the sad reality is that we've had 15 years of stagnant wages.
Wages are going up, actually.
Well, they went up slightly today, but we're still well below, in terms of real wages, where we were in 2008.
And you are convinced that Keir Starmer will meet the promises that have been made by the Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner?
Well, it's one of our flagship policies, and it's a flagship policy for a reason. It's a transformative set of policies that will increase job security, it will drive up productivity, it will drive up wages right across the country, and even Tory voters support it. And the suggestion that businesses wouldn't be supportive of it is
so why are unions
a bit anathema to me.
Why are unions
we've seen research from the Chartered Institute of Management that say that 80% of British employees would support these
We'll
measures.
come on to the rights themselves, but why are union bosses, or many of them, worried that Labour isn't as committed as it was?
Well, I've not seen the revised document, but I rely on the reports that I'm sure you've seen over the last few days.
Well, it was revised I think it was revised actually some time ago. It's just that the meeting is happening, as I understand it, with the union bosses because of concerns. There doesn't seem to be any change to what was already said a year or so ago.
Well, I've not seen the actual revised proposals, but I think the concerns stem from the fact that the language around some of them has been changed slightly, which might give the impression that some of the proposals weren't as robust as they originally were. Now, I hope that that's not the case. As I say, I've not seen the revised proposals myself, but today's meeting should offer some clarity. And my hope is that Keir is true to his word and that there has not been any watering down of this flagship policy, because I think it would be a really sad day for the Labour Party.
Yeah, how damaging would it be if it is watered down?
Well, it's got huge support from businesses, from even Tory voters, as I've said, from workers, from trade unions. It was built by the Labour Party and the Labour movement, and it's done not just to improve job security, but to drive up productivity. And we have an ongoing productivity crisis here in the UK that needs to be addressed. And that comes through investment, but also investing in your workforce and giving them the security that they deserve.
What's going on here, Alva? Because as far as I can tell, yes, there are a set of proposals that include Labour will ban 0 hours contracts and end fire and rehire. And this was all going to happen within 100 days of a Labour government. They'll make flexible working a day one right, introduce a genuine living wage, establish a fair pay agreement, and generally strengthen protections for workers. And that's gone from promising legislation to consultation with business. Is that right?
Yes, well, I think that there is still a promise of legislation. But it's a little bit complicated, I suppose. What unions are looking for today is reassurance after, essentially, rather than anything that they've seen, it's these briefings to newspapers that suggest that there will be consultation with business, and unions are worried that that means that these things will eventually be watered down. Labour are saying that any changes that have been made, there have been some comparisons done. Things have changed since 2021 when Angela Rayner first stood up and announced these things. Labour would say that's just a sort of necessary process of going from big idea to legislation in government. But they're saying that there won't be any further watering down. But basically, these briefings and the way this is being spun is evidence that there are some people within Labour who are less keen on the New Deal, basically. And what we've seen is Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, Angela Rayner so far saying that there will be no watering down or no further watering down. But we did hear that with all the Green pledges, we'll remember. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in this meeting and in the coming months.
I mean, what's wrong with strengthening workers' rights?
Well, there's nothing wrong with that, firstly, but there is a big difference between being in opposition and having aspirations that sound wonderful.
Cast iron guarantee,
and then being met with the realities of government. And the reality is we are in the middle of an economic moment where businesses are struggling. We've had record numbers of insolvencies. And so to say that you are going to definitely impose more stricter rules and not necessarily allow businesses to navigate through this space and to be sustainable is going to be a challenge for any government. And so I think when you say you're going to consult on certain things, that essentially means that somebody's told you that life isn't so black and white. And I think that's probably what's happening. Because what I would say is Labour right now are doing a lot more work engaging with businesses. And I think some of the things that they were unaware of or never thought about have been raised, and that's probably why they're trying to renege on some of their promises. And definitely some of my Bloomberg colleagues have reported on businesses raising concerns privately with Labour about some of these plans. But I think, from speaking to lots of Labour people this morning, I think the thing to watch is whether Labour is still saying that it will consult on things. I think that's what Labour bosses want to hear is not happening. Or if there is a consultation, nothing will change off the back of it.
Right. Does that worry you? I mean, how is it that, stronger workers' rights will lead to higher levels of growth? So says Labour. How?
So stronger workers' rights, there's been a lot of research done in relation to workplaces where workers had strong rights, they had good relationships with management through their trade unions, and those companies have increased their productivity as a result. And in fact, in downturns, so for example, there was one major car manufacturer whose name I won't mention, when they faced a significant downturn, that good relationship with the workforce and the trade unions allowed workers to take a step back, reduce their hours for a temporary period in order to help the business overall. And that only happened because of those strong working relationships and strong rights within the workplace. But it'd be interesting to get a little bit more detail on the particular policies that certain secret business groups who I don't know about have raised concern about. So one of the things that perhaps might cause concern is banning zero-hour contracts. And I think that policy came with a lot of confusion because what a lot of business groups didn't understand, that it doesn't preclude people from being self-employed. You can still separately be self-employed. You just can't be an unscrupulous employer that uses zero-hour contracts to drive your workforce into the ground and not pay them what they deserve to be paid.
Many councils have employees on zero-hour contracts.
And they shouldn't be
doing that. But it works
that.
For some people.
They shouldn't be doing that. And it doesn't mean that you can't have flexibility.
Why not?
You
If
can
both
have
sides
no, you can still have flexible workforces. So for example, if you're a student that only wants to work 6 months in the summer holidays, there's nothing stopping you from offering a contract on that basis.
I mean, do people really want 0 hours contracts?
Yeah, lots do.
For some people, if you're a care worker or if you're a student, as you've mentioned, you might wish to do that. And the challenge is with some of Labour's plans is that it doesn't even allow for employees to have that level of flexibility. So I'll give you a quick example. If you have somebody who is temporarily filling in some work for because somebody's gone on maternity leave or somebody is ill, but if they've done it for 12 weeks, according to some of Labour's plans,
no, you can give them a temporary contract for 12 weeks
you will be
if they're only going to be there for a
right
short period
to
of
have
time.
those same hours in perpetuity.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of contradictions in your plans that need to be worked through.
Well, or are you just frightening the horses?
No,
here?
I mean, look, as by far the oldest person on the panel, right, I'm old enough to remember the 1970s, and so this kind of, the only difference between beer and sandwiches is what's in the sandwiches, right? It's avocado now rather than cheese and pickle, and they're smoking vapes rather than cigarettes. So it seems a bit odd to me that there's no recognition that the reason we have what is now full employment, i.e. below 5% unemployment, was always technically full employment, and the fact that we're crying out for people is because we've had an adequate amount of flexibility in the labour market, and the fact that we are still the #1 destination in Europe for foreign direct investment, and this is one of the primary things that those investors say is attractive to them, is a flexible labour market, is key. And I think in all these things...
Why are so many people economically inactive then? I mean, if it's such a great labour market in that sense, you're trying to attract many more people back in.
That's a different question coming out of the pandemic, right? And Mel Strider's laid out steps to try and get more of those people back into the labour market with assistance and help, and maybe a bit of an incentive too. But at the same time, we are at full employment. I mean, if you look at my constituency around Andover,
unemployment has just started to go up, hasn't
like
it?
Marginally,
yeah, but it's the
like within a margin of error.
Highest in almost a year. Let me just
10, 15 years ago, we would have been popping champagne corks at this level of unemployment. In my constituency in Andover, if you haven't got a job, it's because you don't want one, and it's very hard to get hold of people. So we are short of people, and that comes an economy which provides primarily lots and lots of employment is what we want. You know, I lived through terrible unemployment in the past.
But comparing it to the 1970s is to some extent, in people's minds, apples and pears.
I'm comparing the dynamic between the union bosses and the Labour Party.
Well, we'll come back to that. But let me just show you this headline, which is UK wage growth still high despite unemployment rise. So the strength in earnings, these are figures out today. The data shows vacancies are falling. Payrolled employment was virtually flat. The number of people claiming unemployment benefits edging up. That picture that you've talked about is changing, and in a worrying way.
Well, it's going to fluctuate, but as I say, it's gone from 4.3 to 4.4. It's not massive.
I actually don't think that the unemployment figures are the key bit here, though, because the problem is that we've seen a huge rise in in-work poverty. So having near full employment, you know, that doesn't mean so much if the people in work are in such insecure work that they're still relying on food banks.
Right, so when it comes to the sorts of jobs and strengthening of workers' rights, what's wrong with Labour's proposals if it leads to higher productivity?
I don't know if any of those are, but as somebody who started a business many years ago, I could tell you that one of the most challenging things that entrepreneurs have to do is employ people. And the regulation around employing people is a huge deterrent to taking people on. You have to strike a balance between the ability to operate a business flexibly and, yes, the rights of the worker. Now, our view is that over the last 10 years, that balance has been about right and has produced a good result on balance for both. So whether it's the national living wage that's come in, or some of the other rights that have been accrued by workers over the last 10 years, versus a flexible labour force for an economy that we want to grow, I don't think there's any argument across the world that the more rigid your employment legislation, the less flexible and dynamic your economy is.
Well,
and
Rebecca,
we're all of
Rebecca,
us looking for growth.
Well, let Rebecca... Yes, all of us looking for growth, both parties. But what's wrong with Kit's analysis?
I think most employers are good employers. They want to pay their workers well and they want to give their workers job security. But unfortunately, the unscrupulous employers are abusing the system as it is.
But how many people are we talking about?
The huge numbers. You've got people abusing 0 hours contracts so that workers are waiting for a text message to find out whether they've got work that day. We've got low pay, which is endemic right across the workforce. And unless we take action to tackle these unscrupulous employers, then unfortunately the overall economy is impacted and the good employers don't do as well as they should do because we don't see productivity levels increasing and we don't see the levels of growth that we need to see.
What will you be listening out for today after this meeting with Keir Starmer and the union bosses?
I want to see statements from the union bosses and from Keir that there has been no watering down of the plan at all.
What do you say to the USDAW head who says, look, let's just stick with Keir Starmer, we need a Labour government, don't rock the boat?
Well, Keir Starmer said he's not watering down the plans. I'll take him at his word and hopefully that's what we'll hear from the meeting today. Let's
have a look at this story in The Independent. Government dragging its feet in response to report on women's state pension. You will have heard Mel Stride in the headlines at the beginning of the programme in the House of Commons giving his response to the Waspi Women campaign. I'm going to give you just a little bit of background. Women Against State Pension Inequality, and it wants women to be compensated over what they say was the government's failure to tell them or communicate with them effectively about changes to the state pension. It affects around 2.6 million women who are affected by the changes in 2011, and that is about 300,000 women born between December 1953 and October 1954 who were getting close to their state pension age when they found out they'd have to wait an extra 18 months to access their pension. Now, the parliamentary ombudsman has said that the government did fail to adequately inform thousands of women about the state pension age change and has said there should be compensation. They can't enforce that. Rebecca, you've been campaigning for the Waspi women. Why should they be compensated? They did have quite a long time to find out about the changes. Why should they be compensated?
No, I mean, the issue now isn't whether these women faced injustice. The Ombudsman has stated clearly that they did, that the Department for Work and Pensions was guilty of maladministration and that these women deserve to be paid compensation from the government as well as an apology from the Department for Work and Pensions. There's no excuse for delay. The Ombudsman has made that clear too. And they made the rare decision to lay their report before Parliament because of the failings in the Department for Work and Pension, because they did not think that these women would see any justice unless that action was taken by the Ombudsman. Right. So we need the government to come back urgently.
Right. I mean, Sam, you tweeted this once upon a time. Uncomfortable truth. Many Waspi women are asset rich, all benefit from the triple lock. That is the triple lock for the state pension, in which it rises by one of three metrics, whichever is the highest. Sammy, why did you say that?
Yeah, I probably had a few too many that night. I'm joking, but on a serious note, I mean, when I was in Downing Street, I was responsible for the response to the Windrush scandal, similar challenge, government's failure to communicate to folks who needed to naturalise their status here. But that was in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, right? And this is 2011. I think that the Waspi women did have ample time to find out, in my opinion. Government could have been more effective in their communications. I trust that most politicians won't agree with me in the run-up to an election because these are amongst the groups that are most likely to be outvoting come the next general election. But look, they benefit from the triple lock. The floor, in terms of the compensation recommended by the Ombudsman, is about £1,000. The triple lock has meant that all their pensioners have an extra £900 in their pockets. So to be honest with you, whilst I believe there should be lessons learned, a sincere apology, I don't think compensation is appropriate for this particular circumstance.
I mean, the pay level could cost the taxpayer between £3.5 billion or up to £10.5 billion. Is that affordable?
Where would it come from?
Well, another point that was made by the Ombudsman is that the government can't use the excuse of finite resources, because this was an injustice suffered by these women. And the point that was made about these women being asset rich, as the co-chair of the all-party group that deals with this issue, we have heard harrowing stories from huge numbers of women who have been destitute. Some have lost their homes, some have faced mental health difficulties, some have been suicidal. This was a huge injustice and it needs to be treated in that way. And we wouldn't be saying to the people who faced the injustice in the post office scandal, well, there's not enough money so you can't have any compensation. The blood scandal was not enough money but you can't have any compensation. If there's an injustice, and that's what the Ombudsman has found, then redress must be made.
I think compensation should happen under very exceptional circumstances. There were 3 million pensioners in the UK today, many who are probably victims of this particular issue, who are millionaires. We are in the middle of a cost of living crisis. We don't have billions just to pour away every time the government does something that is, well, the government has done things where the lessons need to be learned. Sometimes sorry should be enough.
Right, well, Kit, should the government...
Not enough, I'm afraid.
Should the government pay out?
Well, it's obviously a difficult one, and I hear what Rebecca says about people who've suffered difficulty, but obviously, I mean, you know, my pension age has been moved out on me gradually. I think mine's currently 67. I'm not sure. I think they're going to keep moving eventually. I might never get there. But you know, there were 2 court cases which decided in the government's favour. The Ombudsman's gone this way. Mel Stride says he's going to have a look. It is a huge amount of money, whichever way you look at it. It's a lot of money and it has to come from somewhere. And in all these things, government has to strike a bit of a balance. As I say,
do they deserve it? Do they deserve it on the basis that they were not, as the Ombudsman said, too many didn't understand how the change affected them. Their complaints weren't adequately investigated and recommended payments of between £1,000 and nearly £3,000.
Well, the Ombudsman's decided one way, the courts decided the other. Obviously, DWP is going to make a decision. I mean, to be honest with you, as I say, I mean, these guys who are much younger than I am, I mean, your retirement age is not going to be till after you're 70.
Oh, you're retired.
So, and because pharmacology will keep you alive that long.
Oh, going back to the topic. Well, I mean, what are the pressures? I mean, we heard from Rebecca, the infected blood scandal, the Post Office Horizon scandal.
Exactly, and I mean,
you mentioned.
I hear Rebecca's point about the Ombudsman saying that sort of financial pressures are no reason not to give this compensation. But the sort of political reality is that there are quite 3 big areas where compensation is due basically all at the same time. We've been talking about the Waspi women, but the infected blood scandal will probably cost between 10 billion and 20 billion as well in compensation. There's a big Sunday Times campaign on that at the moment. Boris Johnson is backing it. I think that that's, in terms of the politics, very interesting and very tricky, because it's hard for Rishi Sunak to say no to his predecessor and say that he's not going to do this when a quite important newspaper is pushing on it. But if they do the Waspi women compensation, the infected blood scandal, there's also the sub-postmasters. That basically leaves no room for Jeremy Hunt to do another fiscal event, you know, as sort of another
pre-election,
something pre-election, well, or it kind of does complicated things around government borrowing.
It sounds like it might be kicked into the long grass. That's what's happening here.
No, as I say, government has to make a decision. So when I was at the Cabinet Office 2 summers ago, it was me and my team who drove through the initial compensation for the infected blood scandal, the £100,000 interim compensation. So I got there, found that it was all a bit stuck in the weeds, and in a month, basically, we drove it out through the door. So there are cases where it's kind of cut and dried. This one is a little more complicated.
Well, should Keir Starmer be promising to compensate Waspi women?
I think he should, yes. I think the government should be urgently coming back to Parliament with a set of proposals. It's been March when the Ombudsman laid their report, and we're now in May and we haven't even had a response to the initial report. And let's remember that nearly 279,000 women have already died waiting for justice. One dies every 13 minutes, so you can calculate how many will have died during this programme. I think it's unacceptable to delay any further.
I mean, you'll remember during the 2019 campaign that the then Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, promised compensation for all women affected. The policy was going to estimated to cost £58 billion. Now, when that came out, and I remember in the campaign, did that contribute to Labour losing the election?
Perhaps, and it goes back to the point that Kit made earlier, that you need to have sufficient time to explain a policy in detail and how it works. So we didn't get the opportunity to explain to the electorate that it would be tapered, dependent on the lady's date of birth, and when they should have effectively got notice, so it would have been different amounts for compensation based on how you were affected.
All right, but you'd like to see that again in this election?
So, I mean, well,
Just
the
briefly,
all-party
yes or no?
group wants level 6 compensation. That's at least £10,000.
That's all we have time for. Thank you.